Buckingham Palace, a spring afternoon in 1953. A young equerry, new to the household, carries a folder into one of the smaller drawing rooms where the Duke of Edinburgh is speaking with two private secretaries and a cabinet minister. The equerry will recall this moment decades later in almost the same words he uses about a near miss in a fighter aircraft. Philip is sitting. The minister is standing. Philip says something, quietly, that the equerry does not quite catch. He sees the minister's shoulders go up by perhaps half an inch and stay there. He sees the senior of the two private secretaries glance, very briefly, at the carpet. No voice has been raised. No insult has been offered. Whatever has happened entirely in the register of a lowered tone and a held look. The conversation resumes. The equerry delivers his folder. He leaves the room. For the rest of his career in royal service, which will last another 31 years, he will never again be in a room with Prince Philip without being aware, at the back of his neck, of where exactly the Duke is standing. He will never describe the moment to a journalist. None of them did. That is the puzzle this story sets out to answer. The public Philip is one of the most photographed men of the 20th century. The dutiful consort, 2 paces behind his wife, hands clasped at the small of his back. The gaffe-prone grandfather of the tabloid era, good for an awkward quote on a slow news day. The naval officer turned conservationist, the prize giver, the patron, the man who lived to 99 and was last seen in public in a wheelchair on a Windsor doorstep. That Philip is well documented. He fills the official biographies and the obituary supplements and the polite memoirs of retired courtiers. The private Philip is something else entirely. Attested by the staff who served him for 40 years, by the prime ministers who lunched with him at Balmoral, by his own 4 children in their separate and very different ways, by his wife's most senior advisers, and by the small handful of friends who outlasted everyone. He was a man whose temper, intellect, and physical presence dominated every room he entered, and whom, for 7 decades, almost no one ever directly confronted. Not Churchill, not Macmillan, not the Archbishops of Canterbury who came and went, not, by their own admission, his children at the height of their adult power, not, in any sustained way, his wife. The aim here is not to call him a villain. He was not a villain. The evidence does not support it, and the people who knew him best would not recognize the portrait. The aim is to ask why the fear was real, where it came from, and why, for 70 years, almost nobody said it out loud. To understand the man who walked into Westminster Abbey on the 20th of November 1947, it helps to remember the world that was waiting for him there. Britain was still rationed. London still bore the holes the bombs had left. The monarchy itself was barely a decade past the abdication, an institution that had nearly come apart over the question of whether a king could marry as he pleased. King George VI, who would die in less than 5 years, was already a sick man, holding the throne together by force of duty. His elder daughter, Princess Elizabeth, was 21, and the courtier class around her, led by the formidable private secretary, Sir Alan Lascelles, regarded the bridegroom with something close to alarm. Philip had no money. He had, in any meaningful sense, no country. He had been born a prince of Greece and Denmark, and renounced both titles to marry. He had 4 older sisters, all of them married to German aristocrats, 3 of those husbands with active National Socialist affiliations. None of the sisters were invited to the wedding. Lascelles, who had served 3 monarchs, made his views known privately and often. The Greek-Danish-German prince, in his estimation, was an unsuitable match conducted at the wrong speed. What the courtiers did not understand, and what they would spend the next decade slowly discovering, was that the man they were dismissing had already been forged by a life harder than anything Buckingham Palace could throw at him. He was born on the 10th of June 1921 on a dining table at Mont Repos, a villa on Corfu, because the bedrooms were too hot. 18 months later, his family was hustled aboard a British warship and exiled from Greece, the infant Philip carried in an orange crate adapted as a cot. His father, Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark, drifted toward Monte Carlo and a mistress, and disengaged from the children. His mother, Princess Alice of Battenberg, profoundly deaf from birth, suffered a severe psychiatric collapse and was committed to a sanatorium in 1930. She was later diagnosed with schizophrenia. Philip was 9. His 4 sisters, all older, married into Germany in quick succession and were absorbed into another country and soon another war. By the age of 13, Philip was effectively orphaned, parked with relatives, shuttled between schools, and dependent on the goodwill of an uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten, who would shape him for the rest of his life. At Gordonston, the bleak Scottish school run by the German educator Kurt Hahn, he learned the lesson that organized the rest of his existence. Emotion was weakness. Self-mastery was everything. Cold showers, long runs, no complaints. A boy who had every reason to fall apart was instructed daily that falling apart was not an option available to him. The remarkable thing is that this background did not produce a broken man. It produced a man who had decided, very young and very quietly, that he would never again be the one who flinched. That decision shaped how he ran his household, his marriage, his children, and every encounter with anyone who outranked him, on paper, but not in nerve. And so, on a grey November morning in 1947, he walked into Westminster Abbey. Stateless, weeks earlier, penniless by the standards of the family he was joining, and according to more than one courtier who watched him come up the aisle, already the most self-possessed man in the building. He arrived at Westminster Abbey on the 20th of November 1947 with a borrowed name, a borrowed title, and a uniform that fit better than anything else about his situation. Weeks earlier he had been stateless. Now he was the Duke of Edinburgh, walking toward the heir to the throne in front of 2,000 guests and a country still rationing bread. Courtiers who watched him that morning later said the same thing in slightly different words. He did not look like a man being given a life. He looked like a man taking possession of one. The first years at Clarence House confirmed it. The household ran on his clock. He redesigned the kitchens because the existing layout offended his sense of order. He had an intercom system installed so he could summon staff without raising his voice, although he could raise his voice, and did. Servants who had served Princess Elizabeth since childhood were reassigned or dismissed. The young princess, who had grown up under the discreet management of her father's people, deferred to her husband on domestic matters in a way that no future queen would ever again be permitted to defer to a consort. The arrangement was, for those few years, almost ordinary. He was the head of his house. She was his wife. Mike Parker, the Australian naval friend who became Philip's private secretary, remembered the Clarence House period as the only stretch of the marriage in which Philip got to live the life he had imagined when he proposed. It ended on a platform of branches in a tree in Kenya. The Treetops Lodge, February 1952. Princess Elizabeth had gone up the ladder a princess and would come down a queen, although for some hours nobody at the lodge knew. The news reached the party in stages, and it fell to Philip to take his wife aside and tell her that her father was dead. Parker described the moment afterwards in language he never softened. Philip, he said, looked as if half the world had dropped on him. It was not grief for the king, although that was there. It was the immediate, complete understanding that the marriage he had built, the household he had organized, the small kingdom of Clarence House in which he was unquestionably in charge, had ended in the time it took to deliver one sentence. They drove back to the lodge in silence. He walked with her under the trees for an hour before the official cars arrived. Whatever he said to her in that hour, neither of them ever repeated. What came next was a long, quiet war over a name. Philip had assumed, on accession, that his children would carry his adopted surname, Mountbatten. It was the natural expectation of any husband of his generation, and it had been confirmed to him privately by Lord Mountbatten, who had reasons of his own to want the family name attached to the throne. Within weeks, the assumption was destroyed. Sir Winston Churchill, prompted by the Queen Mother and reinforced by Sir Alan Lascelles, advised the new Queen that the royal house would remain the House of Windsor. The decision was taken without Philip in the room. He was informed afterwards. The outburst that followed was reported in several versions by several witnesses, and the wording varies, but the substance does not. He was, he said, the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children. He was, he said, nothing but a bloody amoeba. The line has been quoted as a joke for 70 years. It was not a joke when he said it. Staff who heard versions of it understood immediately that the subject was closed in his presence and open nowhere else. He carried the grievance for 8 years. He raised it in private with successive prime ministers. He raised it with the Queen herself. In 1960, after the birth of Prince Andrew, a compromise was finally agreed. The descendants of the Queen and Philip, who were not styled royal, would carry the name Mountbatten Windsor. It was a partial victory, achieved by the simple method of refusing, across nearly a decade, to let the matter die. The household learned a lesson about him in that period that it never forgot. He did not forget either. The Britannia tour of 1956 and 1957 was the next test, and the most public. Philip left Britain in October on the royal yacht, ostensibly to open the Melbourne Olympics, in practice to spend nearly 5 months at sea with Parker and a small male staff. The Queen remained at home. The press, at first respectful, grew curious. Then Parker's wife filed for divorce in London, and the curiosity sharpened. Parker resigned mid-tour and left the ship. By the time Britannia returned to Portugal in February, where the Queen flew out to meet her husband, Buckingham Palace had been forced to issue a statement denying any rift in the royal marriage. The denial itself was unprecedented. It is, in the long history of the palace's communications, almost unique. A reigning monarch's press office does not deny a rumour unless the rumour has reached the point where silence would be louder. Philip stepped off the yacht into a country that had spent 5 months speculating about him. He offered no explanation. He gave no interview. He did not apologize to his wife in any form that reached the historical record. The pattern, established in the surname battle, was confirmed at the gangway in Lisbon. He would not be managed. Not by the press, not by the courtiers, not by the institution into which he had married. What did the fear actually look like in those years? Almost never shouting. The voice went down, not up. The famous Philip stare held 3 seconds longer than was comfortable, the question repeated softly because the first answer had not been adequate. Harold Macmillan, who as Prime Minister sat with him often, would describe the experience in language nearly identical to that used by ministers 30 years later. You did not want to be wrong in front of him. Giles Brandreth, who interviewed Philip across decades and wrote one of the more careful biographies, observed that Philip had mastered silence as an instrument earlier and more completely than any royal of his generation. He let pauses do the work that other men did with sentences. The children absorbed it first. Prince Charles, sensitive, dreamy, attached to his grandmother, was sent at 8 to Cheam and then at 13 to Gordonston. The choice of Gordonston was Philip's, made against the boy's evident temperament and against the quiet instinct of the Queen Mother, who would have kept her grandson at Eton. Charles later told a biographer that the school was, in his words, absolute hell. Philip's private view, recorded by those close to him, was that the boy needed precisely the place that frightened him. Princess Anne, sent later, thrived. She was, her father said with no apparent irony, the son he had hoped for. The asymmetry shaped the children's adult lives. Anne adored him without reservation. Charles loved him with the complicated, watchful love of a son who had been measured early and found wanting. And yet, staff who served him 40 years would not, in retirement, hear a word against him. Patricia Mountbatten, who knew him from boyhood, said she had seen him weep exactly twice, both times in private, both times briefly, both times for reasons she would not disclose. His personal library at Buckingham Palace ran to nearly 13,000 books, many annotated. He was patron of close to 800 organisations and read the correspondence of most of them. He had, very quietly, modernised the palace's accounts and household management before the word audit was fashionable. The portrait was never simple. The man dismissed in public as the gaffe-prone husband was, in private, reading late into the night in a study almost no biographer has ever properly entered. The study at Buckingham Palace, mid-1960s, late evening. The desk lamp throws a small circle of light across a leather blotter. The rest of the room is in shadow. Philip is reading. He reads constantly, in bursts of 40 minutes, then walks, then returns. The books are flagged with slips of paper in his own handwriting. By the end of his life, the personal library will number something close to 13,000 volumes, weighted toward anthropology, ornithology, theology, and the technical literature of carriage driving. None of this is photographed. None of it is briefed to the press. The public man at this point is the one making jokes about Japanese factory workers and standing one pace behind his wife on a foreign tarmac. The man in the study is the one running the family. Because by the 1970s, that is what he is doing. The Queen reigns. Philip runs the dinners. He runs the holidays. He runs the discipline, the seating plans at Balmoral, the rules for who may speak when the radio comes on for the shipping forecast, the order in which guests enter the dining room, and the precise moment a conversation about politics must end. Staff who served at Sandringham in those years describe a household whose tempo was set entirely by him. The Queen, asked about a decision on the running of a private estate, would defer to her husband, with a small phrase that everyone present understood. Ask Philip. He had not been given that authority. He had taken it, slowly, across 2 decades, by being the only person in the room willing to make a decision and live with it. Into this household, in the summer of 1981, walks Diana Spencer. She is 20 years old. She has been to Balmoral perhaps twice before. She is engaged to the heir to the throne, and she has, by her own later account, almost no idea what she has agreed to. The family observes her at meals and on the hills, and reports back to one another in glances. Charles is distracted. The Queen Mother is charmed and reserves judgment. The Queen is kind and remote. It is Philip, alone among the senior royals, who sits her down and speaks to her directly about what the next 40 years of her life are going to require. The conversation is not recorded. Diana described it afterwards to two separate friends in nearly identical terms. He was blunt, he was kind, he frightened her, and he was the only one who had bothered. 11 years later, when the marriage has collapsed in public, Philip writes to her. The letters are long, typed, signed PA. Excerpts were read in court during the Burrell trial in 2002 and published in fragments thereafter. They are firm. They are paternal. They are occasionally exasperated in the particular register of a man who has spent his life clearing up other people's emotional weather. He tells her he cannot understand how Charles could prefer Camilla to her. He tells her she must hold the line for the children. He tells her, in a sentence she underlined, that the family is trying. Diana told her closest confidants that she was more afraid of Philip than of anyone else in that family, and also more grateful to him than she could say in public. Both things were true at once. The fear and the gratitude were the same response to the same man. He saw her clearly, and he did not pretend not to. Then, September 1997. The Queen is paralysed at Balmoral. Charles is incapable of decision. The press, the country, and eventually the Prime Minister are demanding a response that the institution cannot produce. Inside the castle, two boys, 15 and 12, are being asked to do something no child should have to consider. Walk in public, in front of a global television audience estimated at 2.5 billion, behind their mother's coffin. William has refused. Harry is waiting to see what his brother does. The adults are circling the question without answering it. Philip walks into the room and asks one question. If I walk, will you walk with me? That is the entire intervention. William says yes. Harry says yes. On the morning of 6th of September 1997, Philip walks beside them, Charles on the far side, Earl Spencer at the end. The press does not learn for years where the decision came from. Philip never speaks about it publicly. He considered it a private matter between a grandfather and two boys. This is the man the public never quite met. The same week, in the same year, he is still the figure of the gaffes, the slitty-eyed remark to British students in Beijing in 1986. The line at a World Wildlife Fund event the same year, that if it has 4 legs and is not a chair, not a table and not a horse, the Cantonese will eat it. The question to a Scottish driving instructor in 1995 about how he kept the natives off the booze long enough to pass the test. The electrical box comment to a black industrialist in 1999. Read individually, they are indefensible, and any honest account has to say so. Read in sequence, alongside the testimony of the equerries and private secretaries who travelled with him for decades, they form a slightly different picture. Philip had decided very early that he would say what amused him in the moment and let the institution handle the consequences. He knew the institution would. The fear he generated in the corridors meant the clean-up always arrived. No one ever sat him down and told him to stop. The same dynamic shaped his fatherhood and shaped it differently across 4 children spread across 17 years. Edward arrived in 1964, 13 years after Anne. By the time Edward was old enough to be sent away to school, Philip was a different man and a different father. Edward went to Gordonston, struggled, asked to leave, and was allowed to leave. The boy who in 1962 would have been told to endure was, in 1982, told to do what suited him. Andrew, the favourite, the son who most resembled his father in physical confidence and least resembled him in self-discipline, was given a latitude that would, 4 decades later, become catastrophic for the institution Philip had spent his life defending. Nobody in the family ever told Philip that he was wrong about Andrew. Not the Queen, not Charles, not Anne, who could tell him almost anything else. The fear that had insulated him from contradiction for 50 years had become, by the end, the thing that prevented the one conversation that might have mattered. And yet, Penelope Knatchbull, who became his closest companion in the last 30 years of his life, who drove with him in the carriage competitions and visited him at Wood Farm during his semi-retirement, described in the few interviews she gave a man almost no biographer has captured. He was funny. He was curious about absolutely everything. He was self-deprecating about every part of his life except the role itself, which he took with absolute seriousness, because his wife took it with absolute seriousness. And that was the agreement they had made in 1947. The fear, she suggested in one careful sentence, was not something he set out to create. It was something other people brought into the room with them, and he simply declined to relieve them of it. He did not perform warmth he did not feel. He did not soften his face to make a courtier comfortable. The discomfort was theirs to manage. Which raises the question this whole portrait has been moving toward, and which the final stretch must try to answer. By the time he was 90, sitting opposite Fiona Bruce for a rare birthday interview in 2011, asked what he was most proud of across 6 decades of public life, he answered with a shrug. The interviewer paused, considered the shrug, and visibly chose not to push. The shrug hung in the air for a half-second longer than television usually permits. Fiona Bruce, an experienced interviewer who had handled prime ministers and prisoners, registered it, opened her mouth, and chose a different question. Across 9 decades of public life, that small editorial decision had been made thousands of times, by thousands of people, in thousands of rooms. It is the central fact of Prince Philip's biography, and it deserves to be examined directly. Why the silence? 3 reasons, layered one beneath the other. The first was institutional. You did not contradict the Queen's husband, because to do so was to contradict by implication the Queen. The court had been built around that arithmetic since 1952, and everyone inside it, from the most senior private secretary to the newest footman, understood the calculation, without anyone ever writing it down. The second was personal. Philip genuinely was sharper than almost everyone in the room, and most of those rooms contained people accustomed to being the sharpest themselves. Cabinet ministers, archbishops, captains of industry, foreign heads of state, they arrived prepared to charm, and within 10 minutes found themselves being examined. A man who reads 13,000 books does not lose arguments to people who have read briefing notes. The third reason was generational. Philip had been forged in the 1930s in a European aristocratic class for whom self-control was the highest virtue and emotional display the lowest. To talk back to such a man, to demand that he soften, felt to those around him like a category error. You did not ask the weather to apologize. And so the silence held, decade after decade, until it became indistinguishable from respect, and then from love, and finally from the man himself. On the 2nd of August 2017, he walked off the forecourt of Buckingham Palace in a light rain, inspected a single line of Royal Marines, raised his bowler hat once, and stepped back inside. 22,219 solo public engagements lay behind him. He gave no farewell address. He granted no exit interview. The silence he had used as a weapon for 70 years became in retirement the silence he chose for himself. He was 96 years old, and he was finished explaining. If you find these long-form portraits worthwhile, the ones that go past the official record and sit with the harder questions about who these people actually were, consider subscribing to Queen Toby EN. There is more of this work coming, and it travels further when you are along for it. The pandemic gathered him in. From the spring of 2020, Windsor Castle reduced to what the staff called HMS Bubble, a skeleton household of around 20, the Queen and Philip. Those who were inside it have described, carefully, something almost no one had witnessed in the previous half-century. Philip at rest. He read in the afternoons. He painted in watercolours. He wrote letters in a hand that had grown spidery, but still cut across the page at the same impatient angle. He let his wife sit closer to him at dinner than protocol had ever previously allowed. Penelope Knatchbull drove up from Norfolk and was received without ceremony. He gave away no secrets in those final months. He asked for no forgiveness. He had decided, evidently a long time before, that he owed no one a deathbed revision of the record. He died at Windsor on the 9th of April 2021, 2 months short of his 100th birthday. The funeral, on the 17th of April, was his own composition, refined over 16 years of quiet planning in a folder the staff called Fourth Bridge. No lying in state, no eulogy. The coffin carried on a Land Rover hearse he had personally helped to modify, the dark bronze green he had specified, the rope hooks he had drawn himself on the original sketch. 30 mourners only, distanced by pandemic rule, the choir reduced to 4 voices in the vast stone of St. George's Chapel. The Queen sat alone in the choir stalls, a small figure in black, masked, her hands in her lap. He had chosen the route. He had chosen the music. He had chosen the silence between the music. The man who had controlled every room he ever entered controlled, with characteristic precision, the room he left in. Return now to where this began. A young equerry in 1953, stepping into a panelled room at Buckingham Palace, hearing a voice cut across the conversation, watching 3 grown men, including a cabinet minister, visibly stiffen. The thing that passed between them was never named, and after nearly 4 hours of evidence, we can at last name it gently. It was not cruelty. Philip was not cruel. The record, examined honestly, does not support the easy verdict. He could be cutting, dismissive, impatient to the point of rudeness, and he could wound people who did not deserve to be wounded. But he did not take pleasure in fear, and he did not cultivate it. What people feared in that room, and in 10,000 rooms after it, was something quieter and harder to defend against. They feared being seen clearly by a man who had been seeing clearly since he was 9 years old, and his mother had been taken away in an ambulance, and nobody had thought to comfort him. He had learned very young to read a room without sentiment. He had no patience for the small performances the rest of them needed to get through the day, and he was incapable of pretending otherwise. That was the unspoken thing. That was what nobody said out loud. The paradox the title promised resolves into this: the most public husband of the 20th century, the least known man in any room he entered, a consort whose constitutional duty was to walk 2 steps behind his wife, and who, in the only way that finally mattered, never once did. In St. George's Chapel, on 17th of April 2021, the seat beside Queen Elizabeth II was empty, and the question that remained, after 73 years of marriage and a lifetime of being watched, was whether anyone standing in that chapel, anyone at all, had ever truly known him.